Get ready to immerse yourself in an experience that goes beyond the ordinary, where fear and the unknown intertwine in ways you never imagined. This story is a gateway to the unexpected. Open your mind, because the terror that follows is not for everyone. Robert was just a young man with a grand dream, to soar high, conquer the skies, and be remembered as one of the best. But there was one problem. He had no idea how to achieve that. Until one lonely, desperate night, as he gazed up at the starry sky, something strange happened. A voice, coming from somewhere deep in the darkness, whispered in his ear. Promises of glory, success, and everything he had ever desired. All he had to do was accept the pact. At first it seemed like madness, a trick of his tired mind, but the voice was persistent, offering not just the career of his dreams but a complete life. A home, a family, children, and wealth. Everything he had ever wanted, served on a silver platter. And without a second thought, he said yes. Pact was sealed. In the days that followed, the young pilot's life began to change in ways he could never have imagined. Luck seemed to smile on him at every turn. Obstacles that once seemed insurmountable now dissolved like mist at dawn. He became the best, the youngest to reach positions others would take decades to achieve. But as time passed, Pact became a distant memory. A story he told himself as if it were just a strange dream, something that could never be real. Little did he know that fate never forgets a pact, and that sooner or later, all debts must be paid. Years passed in a whirlwind, and the young pilot's life transformed into a meteoric rise. Each flight took him not only higher in the skies, but also up the ranks in aviation. He became a living legend among his peers, admired for his skill and precision. The press loved telling the story of the young prodigy who, in such a short time, reached the top. He had it all. A beautiful wife, adorable children, a luxurious home, everything a man could wish for. But while the world only saw the brilliance of his career, something darker moved in the shadows of his mind. That pact made years ago, the promise he so easily accepted, was buried deep in his memory, like a dark secret he refused to uncover. After all, how could something so surreal be real? He convinced himself that it was just a youthful fantasy, a trick of fate that by pure coincidence became reality. He continued to fly higher and farther, believing that his success was solely the result of his skill and hard work. The pact? Just a legend, a bizarre story he told himself in the rare moments of doubt. But like every fairy tale, the truth always finds a way to emerge. And what he didn't know was that with each flight, he was one step closer to the moment when fate would come to collect his debt. A debt he could never imagine how high the price would be. His 30th birthday arrived like any other day, or at least that's what he thought. The pilot was excited, but not because of his age. To him, it was just another milestone, a celebration to be held in the skies where he always felt at home. But that day, something felt different. A restlessness took hold of him, something he couldn't quite identify. He ignored it, as he did with any discomfort, focusing on the one thing that truly mattered: flight. Then, the perfect opportunity arose. A last-minute trip, an unexpected flight, but irresistible. And as a birthday present, he was given the chance to take his wife and children on board. What better way to celebrate than by sharing the skies with those he loved? It was supposed to be a day of joy, pride, showing his family the world under his wings. But as he smiled and prepared for takeoff, something deep in his mind began to pulse, an old memory he had buried so long ago. That forgotten pact, that voice that whispered promises so many years ago, now seemed to move in his subconscious. He tried to push the thought away, convincing himself that it was just nerves, perhaps the weight of responsibility. But as the aircraft gained altitude, feeling that something terrible was about to happen only grew stronger. He looked at his wife, at his children, and tried to ignore the shiver that ran down his spine. After all, it was his birthday. What harm could there be in celebrating in the sky, place where he always felt most alive? Plane cut through the sky with surgical precision, and everything seemed to go as planned. His wife smiled, his children were enchanted by the view of the clouds. For them, it was a day of fun and pride, accompanying their father in his true passion. But for the pilot, that feeling of unease continued to grow. Every time he looked at the flight instruments, it was as if something invisible was there, lurking, waiting. He tried to shake off the dark thoughts, focusing on the route, communications, anything that could keep him in control. But at the same time, a part of him knew that something was wrong. It was as if the plane itself was heavy, not because of the passengers, but because of something more, something he couldn't see but could feel. An invisible burden that made every maneuver a little more difficult, every decision a little more tense. Then came the first sign. A small tremor in the fuselage, something the other passengers barely noticed, but to him, it sounded like a warning. His heart raced and he looked at the cockpit as if expecting to find something out of place. But everything seemed normal, except for that coldness running down his spine. Trying to stay calm, he looked at his wife, who gave him an encouraging smile. She couldn't know, that inside him, a storm was beginning to form. It was a feeling he couldn't explain, but it consumed him. Something was about to happen, he was sure of it, but what? He didn't know. Or maybe he didn't want to admit it to himself, because deep down he knew that the day of reckoning was near, and he was about to discover the true price of that forgotten pact. The tension in the air became almost palpable as the flight continued. Every passing minute seemed to drag with it an invisible weight, something only the pilot seemed to feel. The laughter of his children echoed through the cabin, but to him it sounded distant, as if coming from another world. His mind was trapped in a cycle of dark thoughts, but he couldn't allow himself to lose focus. What was wrong? Why that overwhelming sense of impending doom? Then, things started to get really strange. A flash of light in the clouds that didn't seem natural. A static interference cutting through the radios. And a shadow he swore he saw sliding across the plane's wings. But that disappeared as quickly as it appeared. He blinked, trying to convince himself that it was just the play of the evening light. But something inside him knew that wasn't the case. Passengers began to notice the pilot's nervousness. Although he tried to maintain his composure, his hands trembled slightly as he adjusted the controls. The silence that settled in the cabin was different, heavy, as if everyone instinctively knew that something was wrong. And then a voice, the voice he hadn't heard in 15 years, whispered in his ear, "You remember me?" It was a cold whisper, filled with the same sinister promise made so long ago. The pilot felt sweat trickle down his neck as his mind recalled that fateful night. The spirit was here now on the plane, and it wasn't here for games. It had come to collect what was rightfully its own. And it was at that moment that the pilot realized there was no more escape. The price would be paid whether he wanted it or not, and that price was something he wasn't prepared to face. As the plane followed its route, he knew that destiny was already sealed, and there was nothing he could do to change it. The truth hit him like a punch to the gut. The pilot felt a wave of panic, but he fought to maintain control of both the plane and himself. He looked at his wife, his children. They smiled, unaware of the storm forming around them. How could he have been so foolish? How could he have ignored for so long the warning given to him that night? Now the spirit was here, reclaiming what was rightfully its own, and the price was his own family, his fame and respect. As the plane continued to cut through the sky, he felt a dark presence beside him, an invisible but undeniably real figure. The spirit was with him, sitting in the cockpit, watching, waiting. Every move the pilot made seemed to be guided by a force beyond his control. The cabin lights began to flicker. The radio emitted static noises that sounded like distant laughter, and the horizon ahead grew darker, as if the very sky was conspiring against him. The co-pilot was no longer the same. He now had a dark air, pale face, and a vacant stare. He spoke as if possessed by the spirit, and he truly was. "It's time." Co-pilot's voice was no longer the same. It was dark, dry, and intense. The pilot swallowed hard, his throat dry as sand. He knew there was no escape. The destiny he had tried to ignore for so long was there, inevitable. Looking at the control panel, he saw the instruments begin to fail, as if the plane was being taken over by an invisible force, a malevolent presence that came to take everything away. Desperate, he tried to reconnect his mind to reality. The pressure was unbearable. He began to sweat coldly, while the image of his family flashed in his mind like a tragic movie. The turbulence increased, and he heard whispers throughout the cabin, not just on the radios, but all around him. as if the plane itself was filled with condemned voices, calling him to pay his debt. The pilot knew that from that moment on, he was no longer in control. The only thing left was to accept what was coming, no matter how devastating it was. And the most terrifying thing, knowing that he himself had brought this fate to those he loved, and all the innocents on board. Chaos took over the plane. What had once been a peaceful flight now turned into a living nightmare. The lights flickered uncontrollably, alarms blared, and the passengers, once relaxed, were now in total panic. Screams and cries echoed through the cabin as the plane shook violently, spiraling toward the ground. The pilot struggled desperately to regain control, but his efforts were futile. It was as if the plane had gained a will of its own, as if the very machine was possessed by a force he could not fight. Every command he tried to give was reversed. Every attempt to stabilize the flight was thwarted by invisible hands pulling the controls down, forcing the aircraft to fall. He looked at his family one last time, their faces now pale with fear, eyes wide, pleading for an explanation, a salvation he could not give. His wife clutched their children as they cried, but he could do nothing. The guilt suffocated him, a pain that tore through his chest, more intense than any turbulence. He knew this was the end. And then, in the midst of the chaos, the co-pilot, taken over by the spirit, said, "You knew this day would come," voice hissed with a tone of cruel satisfaction. The price was set, and now it must be paid. With tears in his eyes, Pilot let go of the controls. He knew there was nothing more he could do. Pact was being fulfilled, and he was just a pawn in a game he himself had started. As the plane plunged toward the ground, one last idea occurred to him. Final chance to leave something behind. Plea for forgiveness and surrender. He activated the cockpit voice recorder with trembling hands and a broken heart and began to speak. The words came out haltingly, but he managed to say the essentials. Confession, an apology, a warning to whoever found the recording, all in a desperate whisper. Today, I am paying the price for one man's greed. May God forgive us and may all rest in peace. Good night. The wreckage was scattered across a vast area of dense forest. The rescue teams arrived at the scene, finding only devastation. What was once a majestic plane was now nothing more than twisted metal, charred debris, and fragments of the lives it once carried. The silence of the forest was broken only by the cautious footsteps of the rescuers, who combed through the remains in hopes of finding survivors. With each passing minute, the reality became clearer. There was no one left to save. Amidst this desolate scene, one of the rescuers found the plane's black box intact, nearly buried under the debris. During the investigation, the tape began to play, emitting faint static before a voice emerged on the other side. The pilot's voice. Its confession, its anguish, its last message to the world. As the recording continued, the horror was revealed. What they heard was not just the account of an accident, something much darker. Something that could not be explained by the laws of physics or aviation. Pilot spoke of a pact, of a price he had to pay, and of how he knew this day would come. His voice was filled with fear, guilt, and a resignation that made the blood of everyone there run cold. Then, in the final moments of the recording, something else was captured. A background sound, low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. A laugh. Cold, cutting laugh that could not belong to any human being. The recorder hissed one last time before the tape ended, leaving a sepulchral silence in the air. Without words, everyone knew at that moment that what happened on that flight was something far beyond what anyone could understand. As they moved away from the crash site, the feeling that something, or someone, was watching them from the shadows of the forest followed them. Pilot's disturbing message would not just be a warning, but a curse that no one there would ever forget. There were 123 dead, including the pilot and his family. On the same day, a sudden short circuit triggered a fire in Robert's house, leaving only ruins. Every year on the same date, strange events occur during flights on the same route where the accident happened. The co-pilot Richard's wife was expecting a child, who was born prematurely on that day after she received the news of the accident. Years later, raised without a father and with a growing hatred in his heart, an old spirit appeared, offering him a pact and renewing their debts of pain and terror. The threat of evil is always present. We can contain it with vigilance, but we can never destroy it, for there will always be people willing to pay the price, whether out of malice, selfishness, or ignorance. If this story made your heart race and your blood run cold, you're in the right place. Here, terror is real, and every story is a door to the unknown. You're looking for more stories that make you question what's real? Subscribe to the channel. We have many dark mysteries and macabre secrets waiting for you. Don't miss the next story. It could be even more terrifying than you imagine. Join us. You dare.